All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. As always, I am your host, Redbeard, and thank you for coming to the show this evening. It's going to be a little bit different. Maybe somewhat similar to the one I did on Thursday. I'm kind of going back a little bit to more of the educational side here for a little while because I'll be honest with you. It's like sometimes you're following the current events of the day, and it all just seems to be like the same old thing, the same old rat race. And so giving a little bit of time to kind of let things, compress and decompress and air out is never a bad thing. Plus, I do feel like you guys and gals do enjoy some of the more educational sides of the podcast. So with that being said, thank you once again for coming and checking out the show where liberty comes first and we are uncompromising on our principles. If you do like the show, if it is a show that you find interesting, you find that there's good tidbits and pieces here and there, consider liking, subscribing, maybe even tossing a share to people that friends and family, or anybody that might be interested in this type of content. I really do my best to try and put on the best, more informational show that I can, and to also talk about contemporary and historical issues in the best capacity that I am able. So without further ado, what is the show about today? Well, the show today is going to be surrounding, it's not going to be every single conversation piece. It's not going to be every area, but we're going to be covering the Anti-Federalists. And for those of you that don't know who the Anti-Federalists are, they were the group of individuals, to do a basic summary, they were the group of individuals that came out against the Federalist point of view. They tended to detract from comments and arguments that were made during the Philadelphia Convention and during the ratification process of the U.S. Constitution. And for a variety of different reasons, either they felt that it did not support or defend individual liberties and rights, it did not provide enough safeguards for government, or there were other ostensible issues that they saw as a threat to the individual and to the sovereignty of states. That's a very basic explanation of it, but I think you kind of have an idea of what the Anti-Federalists were about. It's not that they didn't want to make something happen, but they really were more of kind of, hey, let's pump the brakes here and let's make sure that we do this right, because if we don't, we're going to leave a lot of doors open for infringement, centralizing of power, detracting of sovereignty from the states, and ultimately a deprivation of liberty and rights to the individual. So I think keeping that in mind, give me 1 second here. Apparently my computer battery is just a skosh low. I can actually find the freaking, come on, dude. This is the type of on-screen antics you all come to see, apparently. But we're going to talk about some of the arguments and some of the concerns that the Anti-Federalists had as it pertains to some of the issues. And some of the issues that we have today are going to be surrounding taxation, foreign influence, and the militia. These are a few of many of the very critical areas that were brought up. There's a lot of them. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and hopefully you get a little something out of it. So to start, I have to put this up here. We are not talking railroad today. For those of you that may have been in one of the Discord chats that I'm a part of, I kind of got a little intense on one of those conversations because I have a railroading background, and when people start talking infrastructure about things that they don't understand, it kind of grinds my gears. But that was hilarious. I really appreciate that. So we're going to start with the militia and essentially some of the concerns that the Anti-Federalists had pertaining to the militia. Now, I would like to preface with a couple things here. Essentially, a standing army is dangerous because it gives rulers a permanent instrument of coercion, right? So it's something that allows or gives way to this realm to where they would be able to use a standing army to enforce their will without any issue whatsoever. The militia, properly understood as the armed body of the people, which is the way it was supposed to be, was supposed to be the natural defense of a free society. But if the federal government could control, neglect, discipline, federalize, or disarm the militia, then the people's check against centralized military power could be destroyed from within. And this was a underlying theme that I think that a lot of the Anti-Federalists had going forward. Now, there's a quote, and I do have some bookmarkers, and I do want to preface that today I will be pulling some quotes from this awesome book here from the 10th Amendment Center. Go pick yourself up a copy. They have great information. I will make sure to link that down below, as well as if you do have a copy, I will also put down the page numbers in the comments below. I'll pin all of that information so you guys and gals can go and take a look at that as well. But to start out, there is an area of particular concern, and it's a quote by George Mason that I think is pretty, I think it kind of describes essentially the tone that they were going with. And he says, and you've heard me say this one before, I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, okay, of the whole people, except a few public officers, all right? But I cannot say who will be the militia on the future of the future day. So he's setting essentially the groundwork. He's setting the foundation, saying it's the whole body of the people for the exception of a few public officers, but he does not know of whom will be the militia of the future day. If that paper on the table gets no alteration, speaking of the Constitution, you know, this was during the process of ratifying the Constitution, going through the arguments and all of that. The militia of the future day may not consist of all classes, high and low, rich and poor, and may be confined to the lower and middle classes of the people. So he's being very specific here. Granting exclusion to the higher classes of the people, if we should ever see that day, the most ignominious punishments and heavy fines may be expected. And so essentially, you know, he was worried that the federal government, in essence, right, was going to organize, arm, and train only part of the militia. So in this case, something that would see like the National Guard today, quoted from the book here, but also you're getting the point, and that it would lead to significant issues. And so when we take a moment and we think about this, he was concerned that the militia in its entirety would not be cared for. And as we start going forward into this and we start to understand the themes that we'll start to see are more present with each and every quotation and instance that we go through tonight, you're going to see a pattern to where the worry was that the states will be stripped of their sovereignty over the militia, and they will be federalized or brought into the general government to be able to be used in a manner that the general government sees fit, rather than having it reserved respectively to the states. Now, this was a serious concern, not just shared by Mason, but he did make several points as it pertains to this. And one of the points that he does make at the Virginia Ratifying Convention of June 1788 was, but once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. So when he talks about the militia, he looks at the militia as the instrument that is going to help retain liberty. And the idea that the central government, essentially the general government, in which if you go back and you look at a lot of the arguments, they will argue that the form of government the Constitution proposed to create was not so much a federal type of government, but a national government. So he was worried that the national government was going to usurp and ultimately destroy or use the militia for its service, but also the fact that there was this worry that there was going to be a standing army that would predominate the militia itself. So again, going back, but when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. And he saw this, as did many others, as a time-tested, historically tested precedent and or rule. And so moving forward, what havoc, desolation, and destruction have been perpetrated by standing armies? That's a continuation of what he was saying. And he's amplifying this idea that standing armies are not good for liberty and that the militia does need to be protected, right? And when he described who the militia is, it's the whole body of the people, notwithstanding a few public officers. So I think when we step back and we take a look at this situation here and we go to examine the militia a bit further, let's see what George Mason also has to say pertaining to this. So it in the book from the 10th Amendment Center, they do a good job of pointing out that it wasn't a technical quibble, it was the blueprint for a military tyranny. And that was the point that Mason was trying to make, was the federal power over the militia as a straight road to martial law and permanent standing army, as explained by the TAC when they're trying to convey exactly what it is that Mason was arguing here. And I overwhelmingly agree with that. So there is a point here that I want to read because I think it's very important. In the book, it says, in his letter to Jefferson, so they're outlining a personal letter to Jefferson, pointed to the almost unlimited authority over the militia of the several states. Article 1, Section 8, clauses 15 and 16, right? Delegate to Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, okay? And for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. However, it goes on to describe, he warned that under the color of regulating, the federal government may disarm or render useless the militia. So the theme that Mason is trying to get across here, and the point that he's trying to get across is, look, they may either utilize the militia to carry out the quelling of insurrections or invasions or whatever the case is, or civil unrest, or they may just basically neuter the militia and make them practically useless, right? And as we go on, Mason continues to go on and say, to govern by a standing army, they may harass the militia by such rigid regulations and intolerable burdens as to make the people themselves desire its abolition. So you see the theme that Mason is essentially trying to put forth is a government that cannot utilize or usurp essentially the militia will do everything they can to dissolve the militia, which was seen by Mason as an essential portion to the people securing their rights and liberties, and furthermore securing state sovereignty. And essentially you have a more centralized government that will come in and make it so it's like, oh, we're not equipping, we're not arming, we're not properly training the militia, and notwithstanding something like the National Guard, but also the whole body of the people, right? And so when that becomes redundant, or they make it redundant, then they can make the excuse, or they can put into the minds of the average person where, hey, a standing army is going to be far better, it's going to be far more useful. But as we all know, and what we've pointed out so far, is that Mason warned that a standing army has and will be the bane of the liberty of the individuals and of the states should it come into fruition. Now, it's going back, Mason goes on to describe something here, saying that the British Parliament was advised to disarm the people, that it was the best and most effectual way to enslave them, but that they should not do it openly, but weaken them and let them sink gradually by totally disusing and neglecting the militia. So again, it's de-incentivizing or disincentivizing the militia altogether, and they knew that if they took the hard approach that it would not probably be as fruitful, so they did it very subtly. So I think it's a really interesting point that the destruction of the militia is something that you have a more centralized government that desires, because then that way there's no real obstacle. They don't have to worry about the militia. And once they have a standing army in place, they would be able to utilize that standing army to impose things like taxation and many other forms of law or legislation, whatever the case might be. These were some arguments that the Anti-Federalists, especially George Mason, had made, and so something that I think is very interesting. I want to see if I can find it here. Very easily see it. So I want to do one more quote here by Mason. And he says, and he kind of takes this whole thing to the next level, right? Unless there be some restrictions on the power of calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, we may very easily see that it will produce a dreadful oppression. So you have a number of issues here that Mason was citing, that Mason was pointing out, to where it can either be something that they will destroy and do away with, because of the potential danger that it poses to the central government, and it really helps reinforce that state sovereignty aspect and the sovereignty of the individuals, as well as the maintenance of their rights and liberties. But at the same time, the militia may be used as an instrument within the states to carry out forms of oppression. So I think it's very interesting that we see this from Mason. Now, moving forward, if I can keep my notes straight here, Luther Martin also talks on the militia. And he goes on to say that the militia, the only defense and protection of which the state can have for the security of their rights, against arbitrary encroachments of the general government, is taken entirely out of the power of the respective states and placed under the power of Congress. So he was raising up, once again, the worry that if you go forward in the manner that they were doing at the time, when they were going through the ratification process, when they were going through the arguments and the debates as it pertained to the Constitution, there was a worry that you were going to see increased centralizing of power, and that included taking the sovereignty and the decisions and the ownership of the states away from the militia. Therefore, as he goes and explains, as Luther Martin goes to explain, the only defense and protection which the state can have for the security of their rights against arbitrary encroachments of the general government. So again, it's coming back around to state sovereignty, the ability for the states to defend themselves and to remain secure and protected from arbitrary encroachments from the general government. And so I think that it's something that very much speaks to kind of the thought process that the Anti-Federalists were on. Like, hey, we have to be very worried about this. We just fought a war over encroaching and increasingly centralized government, and now we don't want to fall into that same trap. Now, something that's very interesting is during these debates and during these arguments and the ratification process, the whole point of convening to begin with was to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And instead, they moved forward with proposing a constitution. And so they started building up this constitution, moving away from the Articles of Confederation, which was another point of contention that the Anti-Federalists had. Now, as we go into the standing army portion, we'll come back to the militia, but the standing army portion, Luther Martin goes on to talk about that engine of arbitrary power, which has so often, so successfully been used for the subversion of freedom. And he's talking about standing armies. He's talking about the presence of a standing army that's often used as an engine, an instrument, a mechanism to enforce the will of a more centralized government. This was something, again, that they had just come from, that they feared very much, and they saw as a potentiality in the current circumstances of what the Constitution that's being proposed and debated over and argued over would bring about, as they felt that there was not enough safeguards, and furthermore, that there was a stripping of the state's sovereignty over the militia and bringing it more into the sphere of the centralized government, or the more general government, if you will. And he goes on to say, essentially to restrain danger you have Martin that talks about capping the size of peacetime armies, right? So he's like, hey, we need to have a cap on this. So then that way, in the very least, if this is something that is going to exist, we have to put, something to keep it in check, right? But when he took sense of the convention, essentially it was thrown out. The proposal that he made was thrown out. And therefore he goes to say this proposition was rejected by a majority, it being their determination that the power of Congress to keep up a standing army, even in peace, should only be restrained by their will and their pleasure. This was an argument for the Constitution, right? That was what was told, or that was what was explained. And they flat out rejected a cap on a standing army at the convention. And they said, no, like Congress should be able to essentially be the determining factor. There should be no outside factor, and it should lie solely with Congress, which was the worry that not only Luther Martin was concerned about, but also George Mason and the Philadelphia minority as well. And moving forward, as it pertains to standing armies, I want to pull out another point here. Martin warned that essentially, like the power, and I'm taking from the book here, the power would ultimately let Congress direct state troops anywhere in the Union for as long as it wanted, leaving states defenseless. So the concern that Martin had was, now that you have a Congress that is slated to oversee this, is you would have a situation where the Congress, if they take over supreme authority, and we're going back to the militia here, if they had the ability to control the militia of the states to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions, that there is a worry that they could be indefinitely used, right? And he goes to say, as it now stands, the Congress will have the power, if they please, to march the whole militia of Maryland to the remotest part of the Union and keep them in service as long as they think proper, without being in any respect dependent upon the government of Maryland for this unlimited exercise of power over its citizens. So essentially, your militia is our militia. We're going to use it whether you like it or not, and we will be able to send them wherever we please. And there's nothing essentially that you can do about it. And this comes back, it harkens back to this, to the argument that many people in the Anti-Federalist movement had, which was, you're usurping the state sovereignty and you're collectivizing it, or you're bringing it and centralizing it more into the general government. And you're leaving essentially the states defenseless, but also without any proper course of being able to determine what their militia does, where it goes, etc. So I think that's a very important part that we have to examine when we look at the militia and the employment or the placement or the upkeep of something like a standing army. Now, federal control over both the army and the militia being destructive to the states, as we look here pertaining to Luther Martin and what he has to say about this. If after having obtained the general government the great powers already granted among those, that raising and keeping up regular troops without limitation, the power over the militia should be taken away from the states, right? That's what is being proposed here. It ought to be considered as the last coup de grace to the state government. So what he's explaining is, look, if you're already going to have a standing army, then essentially the slap in the face is by taking over and destroying the sovereignty that the states have over their respective militias. This was something that he absolutely abhorred, as well as Mason, as well as the Pennsylvania minority, as well as many others that came forth in the Anti-Federalist position. And they saw it as a deep infringement on not only to the states themselves, but also an affront to the individual rights and liberties of the people that resided in those states, the ability to secure and keep their states, to protect their states and defend their states, especially from the encroachments of arbitrary actions from the general government. Now, moving forward, when it comes to standing armies being the unusual instrument of oppression, right? When a government wishes to deprive their citizens of freedom and reduce them to slavery, it generally makes use of a standing army for that purpose, and leaves the militia in a situation as contemptible as possible, right? So you're essentially neutering, or you're making the militia kind of redundant, and then you bring the standing army in, and then you use that as the instrument of oppression. Now, again, when you go back and you look at Mason, he kind of saw it as both, yes, it's a very real possibility, but also that the militia may be usurped to carry out and do these things. So the whole centralizing and taking away the state's oversight and authority of the militia as it reserved it respectively to the people within the states, and also the militia is the whole body of the people. You also have the threat of the standing army. So if you can nullify the militia, then you can have the standing army come in to do whatever it wants. And this was the position of the Federalists as it pertains to the Constitution. You had many Federalists that came in and were arguing, no, we absolutely need to have Congress have power over the militias of the several states. And we're also justifying having some form of a maintained and standing army. And most importantly, Martin warned that Congress could neglect, weaken, or even disarm the militia, something that Mason had talked about. By placing the militia under its power, which is Congress, to leave the militia totally unorganized, undisciplined, and even to disarm them, right? So they could basically just walk away, say it is what it is. And I do think to some degree, we do see that with the state National Guards today, which is they don't get as much funding, they don't get as much support, they don't get as much help, because they're under the auspice, ostensibly, of this centralized government who basically is neutering them to the point to where it's like, oh, they're feckless. And I think what it is, and I think the point that the Anti-Federalists were making is they're doing this because if there was ever an occasion to where there was a rightful rebellion to occur, the militia of the states, or the ability of the states to defend themselves from federal or general government aggression or arbitrary usurpations, would be essentially, it wouldn't be an issue for the general government to come in. There's nothing to oppose them. There's nobody to stand in their way. And the general standing army is going to have superior training, better training. They're going to be more capable. And while you may have some units, or you may have some state militias that are essentially more exceptional in some ways because of perhaps the way that they train themselves, or whatever the case is, you have a situation in which they're trying to neuter them, and they're trying to maintain the standing army and not have any form of opposition should the central or general government decide that they want to do something. So it's really kind of a two-pronged approach here. They're taking away the sovereignty of the states over the militias, but they also want to neuter and nullify the ability of the militias to do anything, unless, of course, they want to send them out to do things that would be to serve the general government, if you will. I hope that makes sense so far. In a later address, Martin said plainly, I endeavored to obtain a restraint on the powers of the general government as to standing armies, but it was rejected. And that's going back to the proposal that he made, which is essentially a cap on the standing army. Now, as we move forward, and I do promise that we are almost wrapped up here as it pertains to the militias. We go further on to see some of the arguments, again, that Luther has. I think, let me see here real quick. So I have two sets of notes going here. Okay, yep. So again, Luther Martin goes on to talk about that provision by which the power and authority over the militia is taken away from the states and given to the general government. He's talking about Albridge Gerry's concerns about control over the militia. And that was a concern, is the fact that you're going to see, again, it's reiterated. A lot of these guys had the very same concerns, but they reiterated these as from their anti-federalist position during the conventions, during these debates. And mind you, there are many instances, typically, where the minutes for the conventions, the anti-federalist positions were not taken down, right? So that's another thing that I think is very interesting is we saw this attitude that was very pervasive to where they didn't want to necessarily hear the arguments from the Anti-Federalists. It wasn't recorded. These were statements that were gathered and by others that were in that room or in the proximity, or other Anti-Federalists that were there at the time. The Federalists were very they really didn't want to give the time of day to the Anti-Federalists, which I think is very peculiar when we go into looking at everything that occurred as it pertains to creating and ultimately fully ratifying the Constitution. It's a very interesting thing that occurred there, right? Where you want to try, first off, they tried to ram this through as fast as they could, but also you're not willing to include the arguments by the Anti-Federalists. So therefore, you have a collection of Anti-Federalist arguments that are compiled by those around them. There was also several journalists and other people reporting on it. And that's how we understand where a lot of these arguments came from. But anyways, I digress, not to get down too much of a rabbit hole. Jerry, let's see here. So essentially what we have is Luther Martin goes on to say, Jerry, well, actually, this is something from TSA. Jerry argued that if the power were stripped from the states, would be the most convincing proof that the Constitution's true design was to destroy state governments and pave the way for a monarchy. So again, you're seeing this attitude amongst the Anti-Federalists where they're like, hey, no, pump the brakes here. We really have to step back and examine this and see what the heck is going on, to the point to where they genuinely felt that the newer Constitution not only was an affront to the Articles of Confederation, but they felt the new Constitution was going to introduce extremely destructive means to the foundation of our country, not respecting the state sovereignty, and furthermore, not respecting the rights and liberties of the individuals in a variety of topics, not just the militia or the standing army issue, but across a wide swath of issues. Calling it the last coup de grace, right? So that's something that we just went over. Jerry warned stripping the states of power would leave them without their only means of self-preservation. So we saw this iterated by Martin. And, this is also coming from Martin's perspective as well. He was there along with Elbridge Gerry, along with George Mason and the Philadelphia minority. You have a lot of these people that are like, hey, we've seen what these instances occur. We've seen the arguments. We've seen what the Federalists are doing, what they're trying to do. And more importantly, during this time, you also had Ellsworth. If you're not familiar with Ellsworth, he was in the convention at the time. And he also made it a point to essentially go after Martin and Gerry, Elbridge Gerry, where he was trying to defame them essentially, and he was trying to take their arguments not only on the militia but on a variety of other things to essentially make them look like hypocrites. So this is one of the responses essentially that Martin is waging against Ellsworth and in support of Gerry. I just want to keep that in mind. So moving forward, linking the federal control over the militia to broad sweeping powers, as the TAC describes here, Martin asked a rhetorical question. And Martin quotes, "What state is there in the Union whose interest would prompt it to give the general government the extensive unlimited powers it possesses in the executive, legislative, and judicial departments, right, together with the powers over the militia and the liberty of establishing a standing army without any restriction?" So essentially what they're talking about, what you're seeing Luther Martin talk about here in the question that he's posing is, who would agree to that? Because it's a complete usurpation of everything. You already have control over the executive, the judiciary, the legislative. Now you want control over the militia, and you also want to have a standing army. Like, who would even agree to that? It seems extremely destructive. And this is the tone that you see set in the Anti-Federalist papers. And it's quite a convincing argument. And this is where they felt that the Constitution that we know today was heading, and that it provide and provisioned the central government, or the central government to be known as the general government, and they deferred to it as the national government instead of the federal government, as being all centralizing and wholly destructive to the states and to the people, respectively. Now, on one final point that I want to go through here, if I can find, we're beyond Martin, we're beyond Mason. Now we're going to go to the Philadelphia minority. Or the Pennsylvania minority, sorry. So there's the address and reasons of dissent of the minority of the Convention of Pennsylvania, December 18th, 1787. The Pennsylvania minority, right, which is a group of individuals that attended the convention in Pennsylvania, argued that a government lacking the confidence of the people would have to rely on force. So a government that is predicated or is lacking, rather, the confidence of the people. If you don't have the confidence of the people, they would solely have to rely on force. So they go on to say, unless the laws command the confidence and respect of the great body of the people, again, you see that phrase, the body of the people. You see this with the militia, the whole body of the people, right? It's become very common here. To respect the great body of the people, they must be executed by the aid of a numerous standing army, which would be inconsistent with every idea of liberty. So they were going on further to explain, like, look, the standing army is a bad idea. It's not only just a bad idea, it's an affront and inconsistent with every idea of liberty. They go on to further say, and they say, and warned that the same army used to enforce a law could be used to destroy liberty. The same force that may be employed to corrupt or to compel obedience to good laws might and probably would be used to wrest from the people their constitutional liberties, right? So again, you're seeing the arguments as to why a standing army isn't good, but you're also seeing the arguments and the warnings and the dissension to the idea of wresting the militias from the state, bringing it forth into a more centralized government, and the serious implications that is going to have. And I think, personally, I think when we look at the outcome of how things are today, I think it's more evident today, and it very much goes forth with the fears that they had back then in the 1787, 88, 89, that they were talking about, right? You have essentially the National Guards of the states, which, to be fair, Defend the Guard is trying very much to quell or stem that tide, which I think is the appropriate thing to do. But you do have a government, a general government, that is trying to utilize these National Guard units, otherwise what would be considered as part of the militia, not the entire militia, but part of the militia, and to use them for whatever it is that they want. I mean, you have some National Guard units that are far more deployed than some active duty units. And I think that's something that was what they warned about, and the fact that they could extend and keep them abroad or during operation for however long that they seemed fit. And seemingly the states really have no say is what they were arguing. And so when you have a standing army, it also becomes very easy to compel a form of compliance. So going forward, one of the things that they talked about is the dissenters raised additional alarm over Congress's, and this is what TAC was saying, and then going into what the Pennsylvania minority says, absolute unqualified command over the militia, warning it could become, Philadelphia minority again, instrumental to the destruction of all liberty, both public and private, whether a personal, civil, or religious nature. I think that's a pretty strong phrase there. The idea, again, hammering home the notion that the handing over of the sovereignty that the states would have over their militias, and then coupling that with a standing army, is extremely dangerous to not only the sovereignty of the states, their ability to protect and defend themselves from arbitrary usurpations in power, but also, respectively, the people that reside within those states. So, moving forward, there's something else that they point out as well, right? They accuse the Constitution, speaking of the Pennsylvania minority, for exactly the danger. They have therefore made a provision for this purpose in a permanent standing army and a militia that may be subjected to as strict discipline and government. So again, they're trying to couple the standing army and the militia together when realistically they should be separate entities. They argued against this. And so their proposed Bill of Rights also tied the right of arms directly to defense, anti-disarmament, and anti-standing army principles, and civil control of the military. Because when you have civil control of the military, what you get is a situation to where now you have more of a direct control by the people to avoid tyranny. So going back, before I go to the next portion here, they accused the Constitution of providing for exactly that danger, right? Which the danger is. So the danger is a force that may be employed to compel obedience, right? They have therefore made a provision for the purpose in a permanent standing army, okay, and a militia that may be subjected to as strict discipline and government. So they're trying to fuse the two together when realistically they should be separate. Now, moving forward, again, their proposed Bill of Rights. So the Anti-Federalists, if it wasn't for the Anti-Federalists, we may never have had a Bill of Rights. They were the ones that really made a point to where it's like, hey, you need to make a Bill of Rights. This is non-negotiable. We refuse to sign on. We refuse to take part if at least something like this is not part of it. And it wasn't their only concern. Many of them did not sign the final document, mind you, because they saw that there were too many issues with it. But their proposed Bill of Rights also tied the right to arms. So this is where the Pennsylvania minority, I don't know why I keep saying Philadelphia, Pennsylvania minority really emphasized also what Mason and also what Martin did, which tied the right to arms directly to defense, anti-disarmament, so no disarmament whatsoever, right? And anti-standing army principles and civil control of the military. It means the people have control of the military. And furthermore, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their own state or the United States or the purpose of killing game. So this is something else that they exemplified. And for the people that talk about the 2A as being a hunting thing, that was the least of their concerns, right? The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves. First and foremost, the defense of themselves and their own state or the United States. Notice how the United States in totality came last, right? Of all of those things, the first one was defense of themselves, then the defense of their state, and then finally, or the United States, right? And I think that's very important. Going forward, they continue to say no law shall be passed for disarming the people or any of them unless for crimes committed or real danger of public inquiry from individuals. So they were very specific about this. No law shall be passed, right? So there was a lot of dissension here. There's a lot of people that argued that the Constitution was not only not strong enough to restrain the central government or the general government or the national government that would be, but also that it did not provide or protect or defend the state's sovereignty and the rights and liberties of the people. So I think that's very important. And so I think you can see the general idea that the Anti-Federalists were going for as it pertained to the two individual arms, actually, the militia, and how they felt when it came to standing armies. So I hope that first section, you guys and gals were able to get something out of that, and I hope that it made sense to you. So we're going to George Mason. We're going to George Mason as it pertains to foreign influence, and I want to talk about foreign influence because it really is a hot topic of the day. First and foremost, from Mason's speech in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 17, 1788, the president will be elected time after time. He will be continued to office for life. If we wish to change him, the great powers in Europe, as he was referring to at the time, will not allow us. And so the argument that he was making was, hey, there needs to be a limitation here. We absolutely have to have a maximum amount of years that the president can serve until he can no longer serve. That was one of the primary arguments. Now, he goes on to say that the great powers of Europe would be interested, essentially, in having a friend in the president of the United States. So, of course, at the time, they would have loved to have had somebody that they would have been able to come in and really be able to do what they wish with. And moving forward, he warned about the corruption potential of foreign powers upon the president through financial incentives, right? And this is something that you even hear about today, is the president being able to be corrupted or swayed to do something on behalf of another country per financial incentives or gifts or emoluments. And so Article 1, Section 9, Clause A prohibits federal officials from accepting any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state. That is in the Constitution as it stands right now, right? However, Mason did make point of a loophole, though. And by technicality, it could still be done if Congress consents. So if Congress is like, it's fine, then the president essentially would be able to take these things without a problem. There was nothing saying that Congress would not be able to allow it. It's just the fact that he would not be able to allow it, essentially, per his own. So if it was something that was brought to Congress, they could, in theory, technically make it allowable, which means that this whole point becomes almost moot because there is no protection against corruption. There is no blockade to the potential of somebody being swayed by a foreign country or dignitary or whatever the case might be. And so now that door is essentially wide open. And I think Mason was right about this. I think it is a huge danger. And he goes on to say, this very executive officer may, by consent of Congress, receive a stated pension from European potentates, right? So it's very interesting. And when we look at it today, where do we see stuff like this? Well, we get foreign individuals that have donated money and they have provided funds and stuff like that to presidents. And so it's, and obviously it's not something simply withstanding presidencies, but you get the point that they're trying to make, right? And so furthermore, he goes on to talk about recent history here. It is not many years ago since the revolution that a foreign power offered emoluments to persons holding offices under our government. It will, moreover, be difficult to know whether he receives emoluments from foreign powers or not. So he's explaining, not only is there a loophole, not only is there this threat that exists, but it's very hard to determine whether or not he actually does get something like this. And perhaps today it may be a little bit easier because you could potentially track these things, but you would also need to have an apparatus in place that is actually willing to do something about it. And when there's nothing in place, when you don't have anything in terms of a punishment or whatever the case is for something like that, then it really doesn't matter whether or not you can track it. It doesn't really matter whether or not you know if they get it, because nothing really is going to happen. So he goes on to say, and he warns essentially the consequences of this. The powers of Europe will interpose and we shall have a civil war. in the bowels of our country, and be subject to all the horrors and calamities of an elective monarchy. So he talks about how a foreign influence, in this case, it was Europe at the time, but I would argue you can apply this to today, very much so. He mentioned that it can create infighting. You can have a civil war simply by the idea of having influence from another country, and which is something the U.S. government knows a little something about because they have a tendency to do these things abroad. Not going to get too far down that rabbit hole, but we've talked about that before. But the point being is there's a very real threat of that type of influence coming inside, especially when there's no real safeguard to prevention or ramifications and consequences to an acceptance of something like that. Despite the fact that it is within the Constitution, he did mention that there was a loophole there. Now, furthermore, it's one of those things to where when we look at presidential electors, they could very much be manipulated as well. And from the same speech, Mason goes to say the electors who are to meet in each state to vote for him may easily be influenced. So it's not even enough for the president himself, but the fact that if you can even simply get to the electors and sway the electors to go forth and provide some type of manipulation via manipulating them, then that also is a vehicle or a situation where this can also exist. And the concerns was not merely direct bribery of the president, but the manipulation of the presidential selection process itself. So that was a very real concern. And he goes on to explain that the rotation would reduce foreign interference, which means, essentially the 8-year limitation that a president would be able to have, whether that's consecutive or whether it is every other. He goes to say the only way to alter this would be to render him ineligible after a certain number of years. And then no foreign nation would interfere to keep a man in who is utterly ineligible, is what he was saying. The point is powerful, but the foreign powers cannot easily pressure their favorite ruler if the Constitution forces a rotation to exist, right? So that was something that he had brought up. And he goes on furthermore to make constitutional objections. And in Mason's objections to the Constitution of October 1787, he warned that the Senate's powers over ambassadors, officers, treaties, and impeachments, right, would create dangerous connection with the executive. So there was also a very, very worrisome element that the Anti-Federalists saw, where there was too much of a blurring of the lines between Congress and the presidency. So you have a blurring of the lines between the executive, the legislative, and essentially potentially the judiciary, to the point to where especially the executive and the legislative, to where the powers get muddled. The authority that's delegated could just as easily be handed off to the presidency from the legislation or the legislative body, right? So, and I think we see a lot of that today, especially with Congress abdicating their duties, and you see the executive, the presidency, that is taken on more of the duties than is ever allowed, essentially, in the Constitution. But he's arguing the Constitution was not enough moving forward, and that it really deserved more time and introspection to see this. And you'll see this in what he has to say. Mason goes to say, these with their other great powers, their power in the appointment of ambassadors and all public officers, in making treaties and in trying all impeachments, Mason says, their influence upon and connection with the supreme executive will destroy any balance in the government and enable them to accomplish what usurpations they please upon the rights and liberties of the people. So this was something, again, that Mason was very concerned about in terms of influence. And when you look at that foreign influence manipulating not just the president directly, but potentially bodies and additionally the election selection process, right? You start to see exactly where the trepidation tends to be, and you see where the worries are. This is not foreign influence in the narrow bribery sense, but it is directly tied to foreign affairs, ambassadors, treaties, and executive power, essentially. So it's a very good thing to keep in mind in the back of your heads, especially today, to see how these warnings have come to fruition. And you'll see a lot of the anti-federalist warnings very much prominent or coming to fruition in the fullest sense today. Treaties could become a backdoor form of lawmaking, however. And Mason also goes forward and he objected that treaties made by the president and Senate would become supreme law without the House. So there was a huge push also that the House required greater, a far greater say in matters, specifically, especially as it pertained to treaties, right? Because the House is the representative body of the people, right? So he goes to say, by declaring all treaties supreme laws of the land, and the executive and the Senate have, in many cases, an exclusive power of legislation, right? Which may have been avoided by proper distinctions with respect to treaties and requiring the assent of the House of Representatives where it could be done with safety. So essentially he's saying, look, we need to have the House of Representatives involved in this process as one more check and balance to this form of power, for this carryover of power. There was a great fear that the executive and the Senate essentially would be so in line that potentially they could conspire, or potentially that there would be so much overlap that there would be almost just this consolidated authority. And essentially, there is a fear of foreign entanglements. Treaties and executive arrangements could bypass the popular branch, essentially being the House. So when we look at this, a president eligible for repeated re-election could become the preferred instrument of a foreign power. Foreign governments could use gifts, emoluments, influence over electors, or treaty politics to keep their favored man in office, right? And if treaty power rested mainly with the president and the Senate, foreign policy could become a backdoor around people's representatives. This was the fear that George Mason had, and I think it's a very well-founded fear even in today's world as we see how things have taken place. And as I'm describing this, you can see a lot of these fears that they had very much are prominent and very much in existence today. So moving forward, we're going to see a portion here on taxation. I think this is something that a lot of people really do have problems with. And we're going to start essentially with the Pennsylvania minority once again. The address and reasons of dissent, December 18, 1787. Congress would control the purse and the sword. Now, you can probably understand where this is an issue. Well, the Pennsylvania minority goes on to say the powers of Congress under the new Constitution are complete and unlimited over the purse and the sword, and are perfectly independent of and supreme over the state governments. So when we talked about the militia and standing armies in the very first portion of this, now you're seeing it come around to a different concern where it's not simply just the militia or standing armies that they worried about the Congress having full authority over and usurping the militias from the states, but you're also seeing these issues outlined as it pertains to the purse. And the idea that Congress would have ultimate and complete authority over both was absolutely repugnant. So essentially, the Pennsylvania minority saw taxation and military power as the two great instruments of consolidation, the purse to take resources and the sword to enforce obedience. This was the fear that people like Mason and Martin, as well as the Pennsylvania minority, and later you'll see Cato make his point, that they had. And so the Pennsylvania minority also goes to say they warned that the power would be completely total, right? And as they just described, unlimited. By virtue of the power of taxation, Congress may command the whole or any part of the property of the people. That was something they very much feared. And, it's one of those things to where when you look at this coming, especially after having talked about foreign treaty or federal treaties that could override state laws, essentially, in Pennsylvania, dissenters turned to an even more personal threat, federal power to tax every individual directly, endlessly, and at gunpoint, as per the 10th Amendment had stated in their book. And I do think that that's very on point. And it was a very rational fear. It was a very rational warning sign that they saw in totality. And they went further and talking about Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the General Welfare Clause, is a gateway to unlimited taxation. And essentially that it really nothing would be safe, nothing would be off limits, and they warned exactly how it would play out. And this is exactly what they're about to say. They may impose imposts upon commerce. They may impose what land taxes, poll taxes, excises, duties, and all written instruments and duties on every other article that may judge proper. So essentially what the Pennsylvania minority is saying is like, look, they have the ability to just kind of have carte blanche and impose a taxation on virtually anything that they seem is within the realm of necessity, right? And that's the issue that they had with the General Welfare Clause is, hey, look, if they say that it's for the general welfare, then they could justify putting a tax on it. So furthermore, let's see here. Every species of taxation was included, right? So following that up, in short, every species of taxation, whether of external or internal nature, is comprised in Section 8 of the Article of the 1st, right? So essentially, they're warning that the Constitution gave Congress both external taxation, trade, imposts, duties, you could even throw tariffs in there, and internal taxation, land taxes, poll taxes, excises, paperwork taxes, and much, much more. So when we look at this, the federal taxation could ultimately destroy the states, and this was one of the great fears of the Anti-Federalists. And they go on to say, as there is no one article of taxation reserved to the state governments, the Congress may monopolize every source of revenue and thus indirectly demolish the state governments, for without funds they could not exist, right? So it's a federalism argument, which is essentially, if the states cannot reliably raise revenue, then they are not truly sovereign. They become dependent shells, essentially, is what is being asserted. Congress could use the general welfare to absorb state tax objects. The Congress might gloss over the conduct by construing every purpose for which the state legislatures now lay taxes to be for the general welfare. There's that whole point of the general welfare, invoking the general welfare, and therefore as of their jurisdiction. So they could impose general welfare, right? And by construing every purpose for which the state legislatures now lays taxes. So essentially, they can ascertain those exact same things and use them for their general welfare. So it becomes a situation where they also continue to go and raise an alarm about a federal poll tax, which was done away with. But this is a tax that, however oppressive in its nature and unequal in its operation, is certain as to its produce, and simple in its collection. It cannot be evaded like objects of imposts or excise. Now, there was a poll tax, and it was something that was done away with, but it was something they feared. It was a taxation at the polls, essentially. And it was something that they found was just another little mechanism that was very, very destructive in probably one of the more subtle ways. And as they go forward, they say, and will be paid because all that a man hath will he give for his head. And they describe the individual taxes as congenial to the nature of despotism, right? Congenial to the nature of despotism. It has ever been the favorite under such governments. Some of those who were in the late general connection from the state have long labored to introduce poll tax among us. So it was something that was extremely desired, and it was something that they had been under before. It wasn't the only form of direct and individual taxation, however. So let's take this a step further as it pertains to taxation, right? The power of direct taxation will further apply to every individual, as Congress may tax land, cattle, trades, occupations to any amount, and every object of internal taxation is of that nature, that however oppressive, the people will have but this alternative, either to pay the tax or let their property be taken, for all resistance will be vain. The standing army and select militia that we just talked about would enforce the collection. This is why they were so terrified of a standing army and a usurpation of the militia, was that it would be used to go forth and collect taxes by force, and that essentially resistance to it would be in vain. In their view, it created a system where taxation would be enforced by military power. And I think that's very, very, it's one of those things that is quite glaring as it pertains to their arguments and the issues that they bring up about the Constitution, is what the Constitution essentially allows or what it fails to restrain. And furthermore, it further emphasizes the lack of restraint on the general government in the interference of the states and their militias, and respectively the ability to defend the states from such arbitrary means. So there's another portion here, oppressive taxes that would not hurt representatives, essentially in the same way. And what we see that they describe is they can derive no advantage from oppressive laws and taxes, for they would suffer in common with their fellow citizens, would participate in the burdens that they impose on the community, as they must return to the common level after a short period. So it's one of those things to where it would definitely decimate the average person. But here they contrast the local and state representatives with distant federal officials, right? Their point, short terms and rotation keep lawmakers close to the burdens they impose. So they very much were like, hey, no, we want you to stay close to us. So in that way, you would suffer the same thing that you would seek to impose on others. And what they proposed essentially is an amendment that would reserve most of the taxation to the states, as opposed to having a large amount of the taxation to the more centralized general government, as it were. The Pennsylvania minority proposed an amendment that says that no law shall be passed to restrain the legislatures of the several states from enacting laws for imposing taxes except imposts and duties on goods imported or exported. So it was very limiting. It was something that was very restricting. And they further added no taxes except imposts and duties upon goods imported and exported, and postage on letters shall be levied by the authority of Congress. That was essentially what it is, or what their proposal was, which is quite different and quite drastic in some ways from what we know today. Now, you can see the general theme here that they're pointing out, like, look, if we allow this thing, if we allow this Constitution to go out with it, to go forward with it without any reform, it leaves this massive open door for centralization, for the growth of power, and ultimately a despotism or a monarchy to just come in and destroy everything that that they had worked so hard to build against. So they say that also that in the hands of government placed so independent of the people, it may be a fatal instrument to overturn public liberties. And they continue this about the taxation. And they also supplement this that emphasize that a standing army could be used to collect the most oppressive taxes, to carry into execution the most arbitrary measures. Again, going back and saying that, look, the use of a standing army is highly destructive. We cannot appropriate for it. It should not be tolerated. It's not something that should even come within the purview, and that militias especially very much should stay within the sole sovereignty of the states. An ambitious man who may have the army at his devotion may step up to the throne and seize upon absolute power. That was one of the last things that I wanted to end with here in terms of the Pennsylvania minority. I think it's a very, very strong and very powerful point that they make. So there's one last portion here that I would like to go over, and it's from Cato. And I hope you'll find this equally interesting. So this one, the last two portions that Cato talks about as it pertains to taxation, talks about goods, talks about business, and talks about the effects on the average person. If heavy duties are laid on merchandise, as must be the case, the price of commodities, useful as well as luxurious, must be increased. Okay. The consumers will be fewer, the merchants must import less, trade will languish, and this source of revenue in a great measure be dried up. And furthermore, he goes on to explain the laborer, mechanic, farmer must feel it in the purchase of their utensils and clothing. The consequence will be that that he must mortgage his farm, and then comes the inevitable bankruptcy. But government will find that to press heavily on commerce will not do, and therefore must have the recourse to other objects. These will be a capitulation or a capitation or poll tax, window lights, etc., and a long train of impositions which their ingenuity will suggest, right? So you can kind of see how this all flows downwards. If they leverage this in a general sense against things that business is, and you have this economy that's built on, if they alter or manipulate or they start to play with this, then it all gets passed down from the businesses and the proprietors all the way down to the working people and the average person. And ultimately, you have a situation where they will find other means and other measures in order which to extort. The burdens on you will be insupportable. Your complaints will be inefficacious, and let's see here. This will beget public disturbances, and I will venture to predict without any spirit of prophecy that you and the government, if it is adopted, will one day be at issue on this point. The force of government will be exerted. This will call for an increase of revenue and will be fuel to the fire. The result will be either you will resolve in some other form, or that government will give peace to the country by destroying the opposition. And I think what's interesting here is he's saying, like, look, this will build up. It'll come to a boiling point, right? To where it's never enough, especially when you're funding the largest military purse known to man. You have this overwhelming need for more and more and more money. It's never less. So they're going to find ways and reasons and means to tax every little thing that they possibly can. And so taxation, Cato says, the doctrine of taxation is a very important one. And nothing requires more wisdom and prudence than the regulation of that portion which is taken from and that which is left to the subject. So he talks about being very cautious here and that one must be prudent. But in all of the other things that he mentioned, he shows how it can spiral greatly out of control. Cato is arguing that taxation is not merely administrative. It is a question of how much a man's labor and property government may take and how much remains his own. So furthermore, the new government would leave little to the people, right? if you will anticipate what will be enormous expense of this new government added also to your own, little will that portion be which will be left to you. So he's saying, look, you're going to have very little, essentially, especially when you look at the broad scope and ability of the general government to come in and essentially take what is theirs, whatever they see as deemed taxable or fit for whatever their purposes may need. Take, for instance, again, going back to the general welfare clause and making excuse there. And he goes on further to talk about taxing people in the industry as it's a falsity, right? I know there are politicians who believe that you should be loaded with taxes in order to make you industrious, okay? But it is an erroneous principle. And then he goes further and he asks, for what can inspire you with the industry if the greatest measures of your labors are to be swallowed up in taxes, right? So how industrious can you be when you're left with nothing at the end of the day? Cato rejects the idea of heavy taxation makes people productive. Certainly doesn't. We've seen that, and it certainly doesn't make you want to go to work, right? He says it does the opposite. It consumes the reward of labor. So it's one of those things. I'm not going to drag it out much longer, but you can see the arguments that the Anti-Federalists had. You can see what their apprehensions were. You can see that they were really fighting against a document that they saw was unfit, not only for the states, but most importantly to the people, that it would usurp the sovereignty of the states, but ultimately become destructive of the rights and liberties of the people. They opposed it not because they were trying to just create a ruckus or because they had nothing better to do. They saw the inherent flaws in the Constitution, the one that we have today. And due to the fact that they raised a ruckus, due to the fact that they made arguments and they worked within the debates to the best of their ability, even though they were very much scrutinized for it, and in some ways publicly shamed for it, we would not have had a Bill of Rights. We would not have had some of the corrections and limitations that we see today. They never would have happened, essentially, to the extent that we see them. And more importantly, you even had Federalists that said, maybe we should just wait until the Constitution's done and then we can add a Bill of Rights, in which I believe it was George Mason that further had said, well, if we wait for that, it's likely to never come, essentially. So we have the situation where the Federalists wanted to have this, and it was a document that really left a lot of loopholes open. It left a lot of room for the government to grow, to centralize, to become much stronger than the states, which is the opposite of the intention of the founders initially, right? The whole idea of coming together for the convention, or the conventions rather, was to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to create an entirely new document altogether. But essentially, when they realized that that wasn't going to happen, they made the best arguments they could. They offered their points, their concerns, their warnings, many of which were cast aside and completely omitted from the minutes of the meetings and the conventions. But they nevertheless didn't give up the fight. And these are but only a handful of arguments and warnings that they had. And I think that it was just a good little overview. Hopefully you got something out of this, to see the fact that the Constitution we had, well, it is a fairly good document. There are many inherent flaws, but not for the reasons that a lot of people contemporarily today even assert, as it doesn't provide the government with enough power or it gives too much here or there. It was the fact that it was an imperfect document essentially from the start, and that it would only reduce itself as well as the government into a despotism or a monarchy because of what it allowed and what it failed to protect. So I hope you guys and gals were able to get something out of this. I hope you kind of enjoy these things. For me, going through some of these arguments and these documents and providing an overview of these essential points and warnings that the founders had, especially those who actually abstained in the very end of the day to not signing the Constitution because they objected to it and their rationale for it. I would highly recommend anybody who has not taken the time to evaluate the Anti-Federalist papers and seeing their objections and seeing their points of views to go and read them and see what they had to say. And I would say that when you do, I think you'd be very surprised at how much was actually left out in terms of safeguards to the Constitution and what it allowed for the growth of government. It's very astonishing, and it makes you think a little bit sharper into what can be done better or what can be improved on the Constitution without violating the rights and liberties of the people or the sovereignty of the states, and effectively would provide more. It would assert more protections. It would provide to the states more of their sovereignty, essentially. And so I think it's one of those things that really is worth going over. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of this. I will take, I will, once this is done, I will put down, again, a link to the 10th Amendment Center, and I will put down the chapters that I drew from. And I will also, if you have those books, you'll be able to kind of go through or that book, and you'll be able to go through and kind of reference what it was I talked about today. And so, yeah, next Thursday, it's going to be, I think it's probably still going to be 1500 or not 1500. I'm sorry, 1700 or 5 p.m. I will put a post up there. I do posts on the YouTube. So if you are looking to see where the updated information is, I will post it on YouTube. I have the ability to do that and to do updates. So look out for that. Again, thank you so much for coming and checking out the episode tonight and supporting the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. As always, I am your host, Redbeard, and I greatly appreciate everybody who has an interest in liberty and furthermore supporting it. So with that being said, I will get you guys out on some outro music. Take care and have a great rest of your weekend.